Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to direct my first question to Mr. Mulroney. We have repeatedly seen the Prime Minister and Liberal cabinet ministers and MPs downplay Beijing's interference in our elections. Even at this committee on November 1st, a member of this committee, a parliamentary secretary, speaking on behalf of the government, said that it makes her wonder why there is such a focus on China, notwithstanding, of course, that CSIS has identified China as Canada's most significant foreign interference threat actor. Do statements such as those from the parliamentary secretary give you any confidence that this is a government that takes Beijing's interference in our elections seriously?
One of the reasons I wanted to come today was to talk about China, because I noticed that discussion of where does China fit in, and people had focused on Russia, they'd focused on other threats, and all threats they are. But China is categorically different, and we need to understand that. I was reading something that the Director General of MI5, the British security agency, the internal security agency, said, and he said, Russian interference has an effect like a bout of bad weather. So you don't want to get it, but that's what it's like. Chinese interference is like climate change. It is much more systemic. It's based on the large financial reserves that China has. It's delivered through sometimes the companies that China has seen invest in other countries. It has the capabilities, and it also has the intent, because China, I believe, sees itself in a moment in the world where it has the potential to achieve global leadership. They believe the United States is a spent force. And this is their moment. And that is driving them to be bold and exceptionally threatening. They're also very, very opportunistic and quick to pick the weakest target. And my concern is that Canada not be the weakest target. And I frankly, I have some worries on that score.
Thank you for that. Mr. Mulroney, you were quoted in the November 7th Global News Report by Sam Cooper, which revealed that the Prime Minister was briefed by CSIS about a vast network of interference in the 2019 election, in which you said, quote, Canada is more exposed than other Western democracies to China's interference, and yet as the United States, UK, and Australia strengthen their counter-interference laws and ramp up investigations into Xi's United Front networks, Ottawa remains strangely inactive. End of quote. Can you elaborate on that comment and speak to how this government is failing to respond in the way that it needs to this level of interference by Beijing?
So I believe that China picks the path of least resistance. And right now, when you look at the Five Eyes in particular, that's Canada. New Zealand isn't much further ahead, but we're not New Zealand. And we're a more attractive target than New Zealand is. And I think if you look at the United States, Britain, and Australia in the last 2 or 3 years, they have all had what they would consider a crisis in terms of Chinese penetration of their government, their electoral systems, serious Chinese interference. The Department of Justice and the FBI talking about opening new investigations every 2 or 3, every two investigations a day, I think was the quote I saw. So they understand the threat, and they're acting. Australia has its registry of foreign agents, which requires transparency of Australians who act for foreign governments. The United States has the Foreign Agents Registration Act, but it's also taken steps to prosecute people who have been found to be interfering in the business of Congress and indeed in congressional elections. And the UK has identified a person who had been very active in British politics and funded several politicians as a foreign agent working for China. Those things send messages. We also saw recently Britain leaning on the Chinese consulate in Manchester, England, after they dragged protesters into the consulate and beat them. The result was 5 diplomats left the consulate. So they're taking action, but we aren't.
I have a question for both Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Burton, but before I get to that, just to clarify for the record, Mr. Mulroney, I thought I heard you say, but just to clarify that I understood you correctly, that Beijing's interference in our elections and more broadly is growing.
is growing. And the allegations are what concerned me about the Global News report, and I know that they're working on elaborating the details, but the scope, if it is indeed 11 ridings just in the GTA, that would be formidable, that would be ambitious in any country. That's something we have to take note of, that growth in ambition and possibly a growth in capability.
Right, and now my question, the Liberals have often cited the establishment of the site task force and the critical election incident public protocol to say we're taking action. What do you say in response to that? Do you think that these mechanisms are sufficient to combat Beijing's interference and other foreign interference in our elections? Both Mr. Burton and Mr. Mulroney.
Well, I think that, certainly the recent election, the disinformation that was launched in particular at the Richmond Stevenson former MP Kenny Chiu is largely in the Chinese language and, largely inaccessible to people who are working on monitoring elections. In other words, we don't have the capability within the Canadian system to deal with activities in the diaspora community that could affect election results improperly. So in the case of Mr. Chiu, he didn't have anywhere really to turn for seeking some complaint about being slandered and mischaracterized in the Chinese language. There was no means to identify where the source of the Chinese information in WeChat came from. There was nothing in the Conservative Party or, indeed within Elections Canada or even within the G7 rapid response mechanism in global affairs that was able to come to terms with this. And he was unable to respond to these allegations, which are utterly false.
Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Burton, CSIS advised the Prime Minister that when it comes to foreign interference, the policy of government should be grounded in transparency and sunlight. Repeatedly throughout the fall, we've seen talking points from this government that the 2019 and 21 elections were free and fair, that they weren't compromised, and then they rely or cite the independent election panel findings, even though the findings of the election panel was that the overall integrity of the election was not compromised, something very different. And so in the face of that, is it your opinion that this government is being transparent with Canadians about the degree of interference in our elections from Beijing?
I think that, CSIS, compared to the intelligence services of our like-minded allies, is much less forthcoming about what's going on. And therefore, we need more information about what they know about what sort of interference may have taken place. So I don't know what the basis for the judgment is that everything was okay and didn't affect the election. I'd like more detailed information to be able to make that assessment. When you look at something like the balloon incident, on the 14th of February, or 15th of February, the entire Congress will be getting a briefing, a security briefing on this matter. I'd like to see the entire House of Commons given security briefings so that our members of Parliament have a better understanding of the truth of matters and can form legislation and make decisions accordingly.
Mr. Mulroney?
I think that the bar is way too low when you say that it has to affect the outcome of the election. Affecting one constituency disenfranchises Canadians and is a big win for China. Interfering in 11 is a major, aggressive step by China.
The threshold is too high.
Thank you,
The bar's
Mr.
too low.
Cooper.
Sorry,
Thank you,
Barb,
Mr.
yeah,
Mulroney.
right.
Thank you.